My name's John Passfield, and I'm going to read from my novel, John Passfield's Saturday Morning. The title of this reading will be Saturday Morning, Video 12, A Family of Books. Here is the cover of the novel, John Passfield's Saturday Morning. Picture of a young fellow and his bride-to-be on a sports car, Austin Healey Sprite, 1960, novel by John Passfield. So the top John Passfield is the main character at 21 years old. That's myself. The name at the bottom is the 75-year-old author of the book about his younger self. Let me read the summary on the back of the novel. A 21-year-old would-be writer, John Passfield, spends the last few months as a garbage collector on the streets of his hometown, St. Thomas, Ontario, Canada, in the summer of Canada's centennial year, 1967. As he works, he compares the imagery of his life so far and of his upcoming marriage and the pending career as a high school teacher to the imagery of the great books that he's reading, all while in pursuit of building the perfect load of garbage. So, it's a common saying that everyone has a book in them. In this reading, I'm going to draw on the members of my family as the main character. Myself, John Passfield, at 21 years old, thinks about the members of his family as he's collecting garbage in the summer in which he is 21 and considering the possibility that he will one day become a writer. Well, the first person he thinks about as he's collecting garbage on the street is his grandmother, his father's mother. So let me find page 17 here, and we'll read that passage. Here we are. So he's working on the streets. He's in the back of a truck. He's emptying garbage cans. And he's thinking about being a writer. Where would you get your information from, your material to write about? So here it is. My dad's mother must have had a difficult life. She was a tough old girl and never had a soft word. She would shout at us kids and chase us out of her field. She was a housemaid in London, England. Then the two of them ran a greengrocer's shop. Came out here to raise a family, and her husband died. He went to work one day on the railway and was carried back home. My grandfather died right in front of her eyes, in agony, on the front porch, my dad said. A widow with 5 young kids and a worldwide depression to contend with. I never really knew her before she died. She hardly ever spoke to me. Not the kind of person I'd be able to talk to now. Too bitter, perhaps, to tell any stories at all. So we hear a lot about families in which storytelling is very common, and people grow up and they know all these stories about the older people in their family and how they live. But in this case, this lady, my grandmother, never told any stories. Like, was she bitter? Was she angry? Was she upset? Just never told about her earlier life at all that I was aware of. Okay, another grandma, that was my dad's mother. Going to page 35 here, just let me find it. Whoops. There we are. Another grandma on my mother's side, my mother's mother, of course. Did she have a story that would make a book? My other grandma, Grandma Davies, might have had a good life until she got breast cancer near the end. My mom sometimes worries that she'll get it too. A young girl in Faversham, England, fell in love with a sailor lad, married and had 5 kids, picked hops as the kettle boiled while her kids played games in the fields. My mom makes life at the mill house sound like a dream. But her mother must have worried about her husband, away at the war. A little old lady with snow white hair and a dressing gown. I was only 5 years old. My mom and I used to visit her until she died. So, a lot of stories there that she never told me about. She was a very sick lady, not old by age, I don't think, in her 60s maybe, but seemed like an old lady with white hair and sick at the end, and I was only 5 years old when she died, but picking hops in England as a young girl and then with her young family, husband away in the First World War in the Royal Marines, emigrating to Canada. Lots to tell about. Everybody has a novel in them, but some people don't really tell much. I think she was more outgoing than my other grandmother, who might have been hard and bitter, but was certainly silent. But I never knew those stories except through my mom. My grandfather on my mother's side, Grandpa Davies to me. Let me find page 53. All this while, of course, I, the 21-year-old main character, am emptying garbage cans in the back of an open truck in the summer of 1967. But thinking about the possibility of being a writer and where writers get their material from and what I might be able to write about. Grandpa Davies only spoke once about his adventures. He would sit in the rocking chair, excuse me, on the porch at Uncle Claude's house and say nothing at all. Just a question or two about how I was doing in school. When he starts to thump his hand in the arm of the rocker, it's time to leave, my mom would always say. But that time when our grandpa was sick and couldn't climb the stairs and stayed at our house for a week, he told him getting stuck in the ice in the harbor at Archangel after the war, the First World War, and having to carry all his kit on his back on the frozen trails. He never spoke, even once, about Gallipoli. It was Mom who told us he was there. I would have liked to hear him talk about it, but you never asked an old soldier about the war. So he was a Bernardo boy, grew up in the East End of London. My mom, I think, thought she was an orphan, or he was an orphan, but it turned out later, when we got the reports after my mom died, he had a father. His mom had died in childbirth, and the father gave him up to the Bernardo homes, and they sent him and his younger brother out to Canada when my grandfather was 12 years old. So think of all the stories he would have had to tell. He grew up and went back to England to meet his siblings who had stayed there, joined the Royal Marines, fought at Gallipoli in 1915, fought in Archangel, in 1919 when the British were trying to overthrow the Red Revolution in Russia, the British Expeditionary Force, and hardly said a word all those years. And he died when I was a teenager. So everybody has many, many stories in them. That's the point. And that's my grandfather, Walter Davies. Let's go on. That was page 53. Page 77, a little more about that. Yeah, still with Walter Davies. What did Grandpa Davies do at Gallipoli? Does he think about it at all? Churchill's folly, the soft underbelly, the Turkish guns, all these things we read in the history books. He never mentioned it to us, and we knew enough not to mention it to him. He fell into a history book and climbed back out again. So the old soldiers were taken away. Some of them volunteered, of course. Others were conscripted. Fought the war. He was already in the Marines when the war broke out. And then came home and didn't want to think about the war or talk about the war. And everybody wanted to get on with life. So it never occurred to anybody to even ask them. It wasn't a case of these old soldiers bursting with stories to tell and feeling ignored because nobody asked them. They weren't interested in talking about it either. It was all behind them. They wanted it behind them. And yet, think of the stories these people had inside them, which were affecting their thoughts and their behavior. Let's go to 97 for just one more item about Walter Davies, my grandfather. Here it is. My grandpa, Walter Davies, and the story of the icebound ship. And never another word about the war. Gallipoli was brutal, but if Mom hadn't told me he was there, I would never have known. So imagine that, I was 16, 17 when he died. So living all these years with a person who'd fought at Archangel, with the White Russians, as they called them, against the Red Russians, the communists, fought at Gallipoli in 1915 and never mentioned it. And I didn't even know about Gallipoli. Okay, let's go on. Not everybody had, I almost said a glamorous life, referring to the war. I don't think they thought it was glamorous, but not everybody had that sort of large world life where they were taken away from their homes and sent across the world and risked their lives. But nevertheless, everybody's life is interesting. That's the point I'm making in this reading. My Uncle Claude, who was my mother's brother. Uncle Claude has a good life now, but he had his problems in the early days. He started work in a brickyard shortly after the Davies family came to Canada. Then he got a job in an iron foundry. Hard and dirty work and not very well paid. He had finished school in England and was scrubbing pots and pans. Then his family came out here and he worked on a farm. He belonged to one of those book clubs when he was young for a number of years. They would send a book a month for him to read. War and Peace and all the classics on the shelves at the cottage. What he had then and what he has now. Traveling everywhere in the world and making friends. Wonder if Uncle Claude ever thinks of writing things down. So a pretty grim life, scrubbing pots in the rectory in England after he graduated, I guess you could say, from what we would call elementary school. That looked like his future. Well, then his parents decided to come to Canada. Well, he ends up at 14 in a brickyard and 16 in a kind of a steel mill. He becomes a church sexton, very low paid, never became a rich man, but he saved every penny, traveled the world. I'd say half of his travels he paid for out of his meager savings. And he was such a charming man and a bachelor that people liked him and invited him to come other places in the world. And so he had a lot of free travels where he was the charming man that they all wanted to entertain. And he reciprocated. He had bought a cottage, again with meager savings, and had people come and stay with him on the beach at Port Stanley on Lake Erie. So quite a life, both of hardship and enjoyment. Did he ever think of writing things down? Well, he didn't. Let's go to another uncle. That was my mother's brother. Let's go to my dad's brother. I'll just find it here first. 89. Here we are. Uncle Ken has had a very interesting life. The first part, anyway. We don't see him very often, even though he lives right across the field. So my dad and his brother, two Gary Coopers, I think of them, they just kind of said yup and nope when they talked. Very private people, and they lived very close to each other and only saw each other occasionally. He told my brother and me one time that he went all across Europe behind the D-Day invasion. France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, the Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. They would fix any army vehicle that had its electrical system destroyed. They were right up close to the fighting front, and were told not to start to fix anything that might take more than 5 hours. More than once, he told us, he had to throw all his gear into the back of the truck and hightail it out of there. Wonder if Uncle Ken ever thinks about writing a book. Well, he never did, and he had a whole life other than following the troops across D-Day within 5 hours of the fighting. But didn't write any of that at all. My dad, I'll go to page 107 here. Excuse me for clearing my throat here. Yeah, here we are. My dad. My dad has done a lot of things in his 58 years, so I had to kind of figure that out. When I was 21, how old was my dad? Well, he was 58. He's done every kind of laboring job that there is. His mother was a widow with 5 kids during the Great Depression. We all sat down at the dining room table one winter, Dad and Bob and Ann and me, that's my brother and sister and I, and Dad read to us from the diary he kept out west. He told us stories as he inked the penciled words. He was a hobo in British Columbia, a cowboy in Alberta, and a farmhand in Saskatchewan. He worked on the railway during the war, making up train loads for shipment overseas. They worked on 24-hour shifts. He used to sleep in the roundhouse and then get up and work. He built 2 houses by himself with his bare hands. Surely in all of that, my dad could find a novel or 2. Well, more about my dad and his stories as I make my conclusion. On to my mom, page 125. Here we are. My mom tells us stories, but she never writes anything down. She tells us of the Guildhall and the Market Square in Faversham, that's in Kent, in England, and how the Davies kids would walk from village to village with their granddad, Henry Kennett, and how Henry Kennett went out to work on a neighboring farm at 12 years old, and his father made him the wooden box that we have in our bedroom, and how the family lived in the miller's house in Ospringe by the Roman road, and how she trembled under the covers with the other kids as the big guns boomed over the house while their dad was off fighting in the First World War, and how she couldn't go uptown here in St. Thomas, in Canada, during the Second World War without meeting a woman who'd lost a husband or a son. I wonder if Mom has ever thought about writing a book. Well, more about my mom and her stories in a minute, but there we are. She lived in a house which was only about 10, 15 houses from the road on which Chaucer's pilgrims walked. She called it the Roman Road. There's a whole Roman history to that part of England and the world. They picked hops in the fields when they were kids. Their mother was picking the hops. They played in the fields. She was a child during the First World War with the big guns booming overhead, aiming at the dirigibles. She was a young mother during the Second World War when, even though St. Thomas wasn't involved in the war in terms of, armies on that turf, there were people from St. Thomas who were getting maimed and killed on a daily basis pretty well during the Second World War. But aside from that, just everyday living, is a fund of stories as well, lifestyle stories. So those are the members of my family. Let me read a note that I wrote with this topic in mind. The idea that everybody has a book in them. Here it is. None of the people with whom I grew up went on to write a novel about their lives. However, in thinking about the possibilities, I went on to write 3 novels that draw on the stories of my own family. The book from which I've been reading is, of course, my own novel, John Passfield, Saturday Morning. At a certain point in my writing career, I decided I could make a novel out of the stories of my mother's family in England, on the brink of their decision to leave that country, the country of their culture and of their ancestors, and move to Canada. The result is this novel, Ospringe, A Visit with Granddad. So that's a picture of my mom's family. She's a little younger there than I made her in the novel, but people didn't take a lot of photos in those days, so that's the closest one I had. My mom at the bottom corner, which, would be your left, I guess. Okay. And her father, a Royal Marine in uniform, seated, and her mother seated, and her brothers in the middle. Her granddad, Henry Kennett, with whom the kids used to go walking, and that's the main story of this novel, and the mother's older sister as well. Let me just read the summary on the back. On a Saturday morning in May 1920, 2 of the Davies children, 8-year-old Gertrude Violet Davies, that's my mother, and her 13-year-old brother Claude Laverne Davies, whom I talked about earlier, leave their home at the Mill House on Water Lane in Ospringe, Kent, and walk to 2 Middle Row in the nearby market town of Faversham, where their granddad Henry Kennett lives. After polishing the fireman's buttons, the 3 of them go for a walk, during which they share their cheerful chatter and think their private thoughts. So I know wars are spectacular, but so's everyday life is interesting, if not spectacular, I suppose, eh? Well worth writing about, the texture of daily life as it's being lived. Later, I decided I could make a novel out of my father's life at a time when he and the rest of the world were living through the Great Depression of the 1930s. This novel, my dad's novel, here it is here, is Cyril Passfield, my dad's name, Out West, a novel by John Passfield. That's my dad kneeling at the bottom and blowing on the fire. His friend Charlie, whose stories were so interesting and so helpful to me, along with my dad's diary, as I read earlier, of the daily events as they were hobos all the way out to BC, cowboys in British Columbia, but not getting paid, farmhands who were getting paid, but harder work in Saskatchewan. Here's the summary. In June 1932, in the depths of the Great Depression, 2 part-time railway workers, 23-year-old Cyril Passfield, my dad, and his friend Charlie Thompson, decide to leave their hometown in St. Thomas, Ontario. They go on the hobo, joining the great army of the unemployed who are riding the trains back and forth across Canada. As they travel west, they hope to get work in the harvest, or maybe hop a freighter in Vancouver and see the world. The novel is based on Cyril Passfield's diary of the summer of 1932. I was able to write these novels because of 2 things. Number 1, my knowledge of the stories of the members of my family, and number 2, my conviction that every one of us thinks about our lives in the same way. We take the experiences that we have had, the stories of hope and of fear, the stories of ecstasy and of pain, of satisfaction and disappointment, and we turn them into imagery of potential significance in order to evaluate our lives. We do this. We think in this way in order to answer two pertinent questions. Number one, how did I get here? And number two, where do I go from here? And these are more mental than physical questions. Number one, how did I reach this point on my mental journey through life? And number two, where do I go in my next mental journey through life? There are no simple people, because all of us lead complex lives. These questions are complex in their asking and complex in their answering. This is why I believe it necessary to develop a highly complex literary instrument, the poetic novel, in which to explore the complexity of what it is to be human, both at the crisis moments and at the most everyday moments of our lives. Well, the novel is on Amazon. I'll just hold it up here if I can dig it out of the pile. Here it is, John Passfield, Saturday Morning, a novel by John Passfield. It's also on my publisher's website, rocksmillspress.com, rocksmillspress.com, with more information there. It's also on my website, johnpassfield.ca, johnpassfield.ca. 2 free books there. A planning notebook in which I plan and write the novel and record what I'm thinking as I do so, and a journal in which I reflect on writing and what a novel is, what a poetic novel is, and how imagery works and so on as I'm polishing the novel. So those 2 books are free on my website, johnpassfield.ca. Lastly, I'll say thank you for watching this video.